Chapter 2 Road Part 1. A canopy of trees covered Twilight and Starswirl in darkness, shrouding out the meager light of the crescent moon in the sky above. They had traveled well into the night, and Twilight began to wonder if Starswirl planned to stop and rest at all before they got to their destination. Starswirl's horn lit their path, but still, Twilight managed to stumble on the rough ground of the forest floor, rocks scraping her sore hooves. Starswirl had opted against following the smooth road. Sweat had built up between her flanks and saddlebags during the heat of the day. Now the cold night breeze that blew through the trees made her shiver. She had long since pulled out a traveling cloak to shield herself against the chill. Twilight plodded on. On the bright side, at least she knew where they were going. Apparently, Starswirl had an old friend of his he wanted to meet at the Helping Hoof Inn, about 3 days' travel from Candlekeep. Although, if Starswirl planned on marching until they both collapsed from exhaustion, it could take a fraction of that time. She noticed that she wasn't the only one suffering. Starswirl expressed his own share of grunts and grimaces. As fit as he was for his age, years of a relaxed and scholarly lifestyle couldn't have been making this easy on him. She wished Starswirl would tell her what had him so worried.
You know, I'm not a filly anymore. You can tell me what's going on,
she finally said, panting. What was that? Starswirl said, not looking back at her.
I'm not a filly anymore. You can tell me what's going on.
This time she stopped, stamping her hoof in exasperation, which only served to make it hurt more. She was certain that Starswirl had heard her the first time. Starswirl stopped as well, turning back to look at her. They stood on the edge of a clearing, with 3 circular rings of stones arrayed on the ground within, likely placed there by druids or perhaps by superstitious woods ponies. This isn't the time to have this conversation, Twilight, he said. Look, I'll tell you what I know when we get to the Helping Hoof, I promise.
All right, fine. But can we at least get some rest? We should keep our strength up,
Twilight said. A dark expression crossed Starswirl's features. He spun, gazing around the clearing intently. It's too late for that now, he murmured, barely audible. You need to get to the Helping Hoof Inn, Twilight, no matter what happens, he said, this time just loud enough to be heard clearly by Twilight. He tapped the end of his staff on the ground 3 times and gave her a sad smile. Twilight tried to speak, to ask him what he meant. She opened her mouth. She felt the air pass through her throat, but no sound came.
Magic,
she realized.
What spells had Starswirl been storing in that staff?
Her attention snapped to the far edge of the clearing when she heard something crashing through the underbrush beyond. A dull clang of metal on metal accompanied the sound of breaking branches. She watched in horror as Starswirl strode out into the center of the clearing, his eyes fixed on the source of the sound. Moments later, a figure coated in charcoal black armor emerged into the clearing. Twilight remained rooted to the spot as the armored figure swept its malevolent gaze over her. The helmet's face looked like the maw of a demon. She thought she saw the muzzle of a pony within the darkness of its confines, but all she could truly make out were 2 burning lights where its eyes should have been. Spikes and jagged metal edges adorned the figure's armor. A spike large enough to encase a unicorn's horn protruded from the helm. Slightly to the left of the figure, a dark miasma held a massive tower shield covered in arcane symbols. Its jagged, sharpened edge glinted in the moonlight. Her heart raced in panic, but the figure looked straight through her. Then its gaze continued past her. The figure spoke, its rumbling voice clearly male. Where is your ward, Starswirl? Twilight looked down. Her hooves were gone. She was invisible. She glanced back up to see two more figures step out into the clearing. Hideously massive knots of muscle deformed their limbs, while tiny, frail-looking wings drooped pitifully from their backs. Ogres. A race twisted from Pegasi by dark magic long ago. What they lacked in intelligence, they more than made up for with raw strength and a cruel disposition. Both of them had a hoof encased in a vicious, spiked mace. "She's in the safety of Candlekeep," Starswirl countered. His voice held no fear. "Do you think I would bring her out here, with the likes of you afoot?" He spat. "Murderer. I've long reconciled my lot. If I must be a murderer to stop 1,000 murderers, then a murderer I will be. You know what I must do. Stand aside and I will spare you. If you think that you can defeat an archmage with brute strength, then you are wrong. Fight me if you must, but I will not allow you to harm Twilight Sparkle." Starswirl stood defiantly, his head held high, his staff ready. "So be it." The armored figure lurched into motion. Starswirl breathed, and a blast of fire leapt from his horn, throwing the ogres off their feet. Their charred corpses would never rise again. The figure ducked behind his shield as the fire raged around him. The wall of metal absorbed the blast, leaving a cone of clear air behind it. As the figure closed the distance, Starswirl channeled a spell through his horn that called up a protective, multi-layered stone shell from the ground beneath his hooves. The figure held, for a split second, his shield aloft, ready to strike. From the surrounding trees, two metal bolts arced forth, striking Starswirl. The bolts each shattered a layer of Starswirl's stony defense, but did no deeper harm. The bolts themselves were not the threat. They carried something far more dangerous with them. Twilight had seen the faint signs of abjuration glowing around the bolts as they traveled through the air. When they both hit their mark, the last of Starswirl's protection vanished. Bolts of dispelling, Twilight realized. The figure attacked. When his shield struck Starswirl with a vicious crack, Twilight screamed, silent and helpless. Her magic was likely too weak to truly harm the figure, and at this distance her levitation would be too weak for her to parry the brutal stroke of his shield with Solstice. Finally, her hooves responded to her, and she started to move. If she could close the distance, maybe she could stop the second blow. Twilight felt time pass slowly. She saw Starswirl spin to the ground with a hard thud. One of his shattered ribs stuck grotesquely out of his chest. A deep dent creased the side of his frail old body. She saw a glimmer of magic as a contingency spell hidden in Starswirl's staff fired. A second multi-layered skin of stone leapt up to encase Starswirl, and other protections were likely to follow. But before the staff could complete its task, a single blow from the figure's shield shattered it into dozens of fragments. In the same instant, Starswirl fashioned another spell with his horn. With a brilliant flash, a single lightning bolt arced between the two trees. Two charred griffin corpses started to fall. Twilight felt hope swell in her chest. There should be no more dispelling bolts, and the stone-skin spell protected Starswirl from physical blows. The old mage might live. The figure cast a breach spell. Disbelief crossed Twilight's thoughts. She had never seen a unicorn weighed down by so much armor successfully perform complicated magic. Regardless, a breach spell it was. The spell washed over Starswirl, and his protection shattered completely. The third blow fell on Starswirl's prone body. An arc of blood painted the earth and vegetation of the clearing. It was over before the griffins hit the ground. It was over before the flames of Starswirl's first spell had fully dissipated. And it was over before Twilight Sparkle had taken 3 steps. Her mentor, her father, was dead. And she had done nothing. Twilight collapsed in despair. She could do nothing. There was no tool available to her that could harm the figure in armor. The only result of any action now would be her lying in the dust, dead beside Starswirl. She watched the figure as empty, silent sobs racked her body. The figure casually scraped the edge of his shield clean in the dirt. He paused and took a moment to slide Starswirl's open eyes shut with a brush of magic. Then, with purpose, he strode off toward Candlekeep. He left the charred bodies of his accomplices and Starswirl's corpse without even a glance over his shoulder. Twilight stared after the armored figure, her mind focused and clear for the moment.
I'm going to kill him,
Twilight thought. He took Starswirl from her. He had the advantage now, the strength and the power.
I'm going to learn, and then I'm going to make him pay,
she promised herself. It took all the willpower she had left to rise to her feet and stumble away from the aura of death in the clearing. Her stomach lurched, then emptied. By the time she finished vomiting, leaned up against a tree a few yards away from the clearing, she realized that her hooves were visible again, and she could hear her own groans. Perhaps the liquefied contents of her stomach had disrupted the spell, or perhaps it had worn off on its own. Either way, if the spell had dissipated even a minute sooner, she would be dead right now. As heavy as her heart felt, at least she lived. Starswirl wanted her to live. He gave his life so she could live. She wearily trotted forward until the scent of charred flesh, blood, and vomit no longer filled her nostrils. A branch in the dark caught her hoof, tripping her, and she collapsed onto a soft patch of moss. Lacking the will to move any further, she curled against the base of a tree and closed her eyes. She fell asleep without even removing her saddlebags, shivering as the cold breeze washed over her. A voice calling her name awoke Twilight from a dream. She opened her eyes, blinking them clear as the bright light of day stabbed into them. Her left side was uncomfortably warm, her lavender coat heated by the morning sun. The foreleg she had been resting her head on felt like pudding. Pins and needles shot through it as circulation began to return. She could only remember a voice, Starswirl's voice, from her dream. "I will not allow you to harm Twilight Sparkle." It echoed over and over again inside her skull. She dragged herself to her feet, her rubbery hind legs almost failing to lift her weight.
Twilight!
A sing-song voice called again, much closer.
Pinkie?
Twilight murmured in disbelief. She stepped out to get a look around the next tree. Sure enough, Pinkie Pie bounced along between the trees. Twilight drew a foreleg across her eyes, and she looked again, and Pinkie remained.
Pinkie Pie!
Twilight called. Pinkie changed trajectory almost mid-bounce and barreled toward Twilight.
Oh my gosh, Twilight! I found you! Pinkie, slow down!
Pinkie slammed into Twilight and wrapped the unicorn in a tackle hug. Twilight tumbled backwards. They rolled in the grass 2 or 3 times before coming to a stop. Twilight grunted, disentangling her limbs from Pinkie's.
Ow. Sorry.
Pinkie Pie at least gave the courtesy of looking a little ashamed as she stood up.
I'm just so glad to see you, Twilight.
She extended a hoof to her.
It's okay.
Twilight accepted the helping hoof and pulled herself up into a sitting position. She regarded Pinkie.
What are you doing out here, Pinkie? Why did you follow us?
Pinkie looked at the ground.
I knew something bad was going to happen. I could feel it.
She looked pale and queasy.
I saw Starswirl.
Pinkie paused, possibly expecting a reaction from her. Twilight simply nodded. She felt dull now. The knife of grief buried in her chest had left her numb.
I'm glad you're okay, Twilight,
Pinkie said finally.
And I'm not going to leave you out here alone. I'm not going anywhere without you. You need help.
Twilight nodded again.
You're right. I do.
She managed to smile.
I'm glad you're here, Pinkie. We should get back to Candlekeep. Someone there will know what to do. Maybe Chancellor or Thunderfoot?
Pinkie said. Twilight shook her head.
We can't. He's headed that way.
Pinkie quirked a brow at her.
Who? The pony that killed Starswirl. He was wearing black armor. And he wanted to kill me.
Twilight took a shuddering breath.
If Starswirl hadn't stopped him, he would have. The weird thing was, he didn't even seem interested in Starswirl. It was like he was just a rock to be kicked aside.
She pointed a hoof to herself.
He only wanted to kill me. Why, Pinkie? What did I do to him? I don't know, Twilight. If we can't go to Candlekeep, then where should we go?
Pinkie asked.
We should go to the Helping Hoof Inn. It should be along the road. It's where Starswirl and I were headed.
Twilight took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she had to say next.
But first, we need to take a look at those bodies.
Pinkie blinked at Twilight.
Why? It's terrible in that clearing. Why would you want to go back there? I don't want to, but I need to. There might be a clue or something to tell me why he wanted to kill me. Something to tell me why Starswirl died. Because one day, when I'm stronger, the armored pony who killed Starswirl will give me answers.
Returning to the clearing wasn't as hard as Twilight had imagined it would be. The numbness in her chest remained a dull throb, even as she watched the flies buzzing around the bloodied stump of Starswirl's severed head. She breathed through her mouth to keep the stench out of her nostrils. With her levitation, she looked through Starswirl's possessions for anything that could tell her why this had happened. All she found was a small note crumpled in one of his bags, like he had forgotten to throw it away. Twilight took the note, tucking it away for later reading. She proceeded to take everything that might have been of value. She took the golden bits in a back pocket, the ornately crafted clasp for Starswirl's cloak, and even his ivory beard comb. He didn't need them anymore. She knew she was going to need money to survive. She considered taking his traveling gear, but she remembered seeing saddlebags on Pinkie's flanks. She glanced over at Pinkie to confirm their presence. Pinkie looked back at Twilight with concern, sitting on her haunches at the edge of the clearing while she watched Twilight coolly loot Starswirl's fresh corpse. Twilight mostly noticed that Pinkie did have the foresight to pack. Twilight moved on to the other corpses. Each of them had a charred note, but only 2 on the griffins were legible after the damage. The same thing was written on both of them, in neat red ink, and they both included a sketch of a large 6-pointed star surrounded by 5 smaller stars. Her mark. The note read, "This is a contract on the head of Twilight Sparkle. If you have proof of your involvement in the death of Twilight Sparkle, you will be paid 500 bits upon presentation of this note. If you can present the head of Twilight Sparkle, you will be paid 5,000 bits for your exemplary service." Money? That couldn't be it. She didn't feel like the armored figure wanted to kill her for money. From what he had said, she knew he acted with some sense of duty. Besides, the enchanted shield he carried was probably worth far more than 5,000 bits. She took a few other items as well as the note. A few bits here, a shiny gem there, anything worth carrying. Notably, she found that the griffins had 4 more bolts of dispelling each. They might fetch a decent amount of coin. When she was sure she had everything worth keeping, she left the clearing and smoothed out Starswirl's note in a field of her magic. Pinkie crowded in behind her to peer over her shoulder. The note read, "Candlekeep not safe. He comes for your ward. Gather allies. I cannot be there soon enough. P.S. Avoid a fight. He is ready."
Of course.
Twilight frowned.
No signature. You'd think if they wanted to help, they'd write their name, but no, too much trouble apparently.
Twilight dropped the note, grinding it into the dust in frustration. Her memory already burned with the words scrawled on that paper. Avoid a fight.
Why, Starswirl?
She wondered. Pinkie leaned against her side comfortingly.
It's better than nothing, Twilight. Maybe it's from his friend that he was going to go meet at the inn? Maybe,
Twilight thought. Pinkie and Twilight stopped at a fork in the road. They had found the cobblestone highway when they realized that neither of them could find the Helping Hoof Inn without following it. Twilight read the worn sign at the fork carefully. She pointed down the correct path.
This way to the inn,
she announced. She let her hoof drop when she saw a traveler coming down the road toward them. Twilight reached out with her magic, finding the handle of Solstice. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously as the stranger approached. The stranger neared. She was a unicorn with a soft, long pink mane and a pristine white coat. A brown linen cloak covered her back, clasped snugly around her neck.
I'll do the talking,
Twilight told Pinkie. Pinkie giggled.
Sure thing, Twilight. Just as long as you don't hog all of it.
Before Twilight could tell Pinkie that she had missed the point, the stranger was within talking distance.
Hail, travelers,
the stranger said.
Are you traveling from Candlekeep?
Her soft, melodious voice caressed Twilight's ears. She reminded Twilight of Starswirl, in a way. No matter how kind the stranger seemed, though, Twilight remained guarded. She started to shake her head, but Pinkie said,
Yep, sure are.
The stranger inclined her head.
Would either of you be familiar with Starswirl the Bearded by any chance? I am told he's taken up residence in Candlekeep.
Twilight almost tried to deny the truth again, but she realized her suspicion could have consequences.
What if the stranger is one of Starswirl's friends?
She considered.
Yes,
she answered. A moment later, she added bluntly,
He's dead.
The stranger kept her expression passive, but Twilight noticed a hint of shock in the stranger's lavender eyes.
I'm sorry to hear that. He was a good friend of mine,
the stranger said.
Mine too,
Twilight murmured.
Regardless, I should continue on my way.
She walked past Twilight and Pinkie calmly.
By the way, my name is Sunny Skies.
Pinkie beamed at Sunny Skies.
I'm Pinkie Pie. Twilight Sparkle,
Twilight said automatically. She cringed internally, remembering the bounty note with her name on it. Twilight's weary eyes caught a hitch in Sunny Skies' step when she heard Twilight's name. Sunny Skies' horn lit, and an aura of levitation pulled something out of her saddlebag. In response, Twilight nearly drew Solstice, but the object turned out to be a relatively harmless spell scroll. Unless it was opened and the incantation performed, it was completely inert. Sunny Skies looked back over her shoulder.
I think that Starswirl would have wanted you to have this, Twilight Sparkle.
The scroll dropped onto the cobble at Twilight's feet. Twilight nudged the scroll with a hoof, while Sunny Skies trotted briskly off down the road.
Well, that was interesting,
she said as soon as Sunny Skies was out of earshot.
I'll say.
Pinkie watched Sunny Skies walk into the distance.
She seemed nice.
She looked down at the scroll at Twilight's feet.
What do you think that is?
Twilight picked up the scroll with her magic, unraveling it just enough to peek at the spell within. It was one that she had never heard of before. Find familiar. She let the scroll snap shut.
I'll have to look at it more closely later,
she said, tucking it into her saddlebag. Twilight felt uneasy. The air only carried the rhythmic clip-clopping of the duo's trotting hooves to her ears. She and Pinkie had been traveling for almost the whole day now, and the sound of chirping birds that normally accompanied them was notably absent. A crow perched on a rocky outcropping ahead, silhouetted against the sunset-reddened sky. It carried something in its beak. Twilight thought she glimpsed a small piece of raw meat before the crow swallowed. The road bent around the outcropping. As soon as Twilight could see around the bend, she stopped abruptly. Pinkie noticed the same thing Twilight did, her foreleg briefly hovering mid-step when she came to a stop. In front of them, the wreckage of a merchant caravan sprawled on the side of the road. The thin frames of 6 formerly covered wagons stuck up like the bones of a rotted fish. The wagons held only ashes now. Twilight thought she spied a singed corpse peeking out from behind one of the wagon wheels.
This is horrible,
Twilight murmured.
Must have been bandits,
Pinkie commented nonchalantly. Twilight narrowed her eyes at her.
That's all you have to say? Yep, I'm trying the hard-boiled emotionless thing you've got going on,
Pinkie said.
Should we keep moving, or do you want to loot their bodies too?
Pinkie gestured at the wreckage. Twilight glowered.
If I hadn't looked through Starswirl's things, we'd have nothing to go on now. We'd be no closer to answers than I was before he died. Oh, I get it.
Pinkie made an exaggerated frown at Twilight.
It's more of a hard-boiled grumpy thing.
Twilight stomped angrily. Pinkie could be infuriating.
You know what? I do want to look. We need what we can get if we're going to survive. You got it, Twilight. We'll do what we gotta.
Pinkie nodded, and Twilight wasn't sure if she was being sincere or not. Twilight approached the wreckage cautiously, with Pinkie a few steps behind her. This time, when she approached the first corpse, nausea filled her stomach. She could see holes in the charred flesh where the pony had been struck by projectiles. To avoid losing her lunch, she decided she would focus on containers with possible goods in them instead of corpses. The last thing she wanted to see was Pinkie staring at her with a righteous, smug expression while she vomited. though it occurred to her that she had never actually seen Pinkie being either smug or righteous. Twilight only found burned and empty boxes. Unsurprisingly, the bandits had picked the caravan clean. She was about to give up in defeat when a pony stepped out from behind one of the charred wagons. His coat was mangy, matted in places, and an ugly scar split his face from his eye to his muzzle. He wore a tattered vest of brigandine armor. He held a short blade in the corner of his mouth, and when he spoke around it. "Why, hello there, ladies. Here to clean up after the Cloakwood gang?" He gave an ugly chuckle. "So are we." Twilight turned when she heard the flapping of wings behind her. 2 griffins appeared over the top of the rocky outcropping, carrying crossbows in their talons. A pair of ponies stepped out from behind the wreckage of the carts, cutting Twilight and Pinkie off from the road. Their hoof maces thumped on the hard ground, and Twilight guessed the bandits must have secured the maces to their forelegs moments ago to sneak up on them like that. Emerging from the tree line on the opposite side, 2 ponies carrying rusty short swords and wearing chainmail completed the encirclement of Twilight and Pinkie. Twilight whirled back around, looking at the first bandit fearfully. That's a mighty fine blade you got there, filly," the pony wearing brigandine said, while he gestured at the tip of Solstice peeking out from beneath Twilight's traveling cloak. "If you hand it over, we won't be taking anything else from 2 pretty young ladies like yourselves, if you know what I mean." He grinned lecherously and took a firm, threatening grasp on his blade with his teeth. Twilight fought down rising panic. A sleep spell she had prepared back in Candlekeep still thrummed at the edge of her consciousness. She spread her hooves, taking a firm stance. She had no intention of relinquishing the blade Starswirl had given her. These weak-willed bandits wouldn't know what hit them. Well, that's what she hoped, at least.
"We need to get them to group up,"
she whispered out of the corner of her mouth.
"Okie dokie, Loki,"
Pinkie Pie whispered back. The bandit wearing brigandine advanced toward them, as did his compatriots. Together they tightened the net. He loosened his grip on his blade, shouting, "Oi! Don't you 2 be planning any funny business. Just hand over the blade and nobody needs to get hurt."
"But you can't catch me!"
Pinkie grinned and shot off, leaving only her saddlebags behind. It took a moment for Twilight to spot Pinkie making a beeline for the gap between the griffins. She darted between them while they stared on in shock. And Twilight watched in awe as Pinkie bounced up the rocks. Almost all of the surrounding bandits gave chase. They rapidly clustered up at the griffins near the base of the outcropping. The griffins fired. One missed, but the other hit his mark. Dread filled Twilight when the metal bolt thudded into Pinkie, knocking her off balance and sending her tumbling down the rocks. She couldn't see where Pinkie had been hit, and she couldn't look away while Pinkie fell, her body solidly slamming into 2 boulders on her way down. Finally, her limp body came to a rest in front of the bandits.
"Pinkie!"
Twilight screamed. She had been too slow. She knew she could have cast her spell sooner, but instead her only friend might be dead. Well, that was stupid. Twilight heard the smug voice of the pony and brigandine beside her. "Now, I trust you won't be trying anything He never finished. Twilight didn't think. She acted. Solstice flashed out from beneath her cloak, wrapped firmly in the field of her magic. Only the sharp tip of the blade nicked the pony beside her, but it was enough.
"Starswirl was right,"
she realized. She knew what she needed to wield a blade. In shock, the pony looked down to see his lifeblood seeping out through a gash in his neck. The sword dropped from his mouth as he lost the strength to hold it. Twilight watched him collapse beside her, then turned her attention to the group of bandits standing over Pinkie's motionless form. Twilight unleashed her spell on the bandits, sending the magic through her horn. With the griffin still reloading, she knew they couldn't stop her. They didn't stand a chance. Most of them dropped unconscious onto the dust, but 2 of them managed to shake it off. They faced her, fear in their eyes.
If they killed her,
She thought. She advanced on them, her eyes cold and merciless. Solstice floated menacingly beside her, its tip red with blood. She would make them pay. Twilight stopped short and stared on in shock when Pinkie suddenly jumped to her feet, her hooves lashing out. Pinkie pummeled both bandits in the jaw with a quick 1-2 punch before they could react. And while they were reeling from her blows, she tripped them up with her hind legs. They struggled to get back to their feet, but before they could stand, Pinkie finished the work of Twilight's sleep spell with 2 solid kicks, leaving them out cold.
Pinkie!
Twilight cried in joy, surging forward. She let Solstice drop from her levitation, and she wrapped Pinkie in a tight embrace. Pinkie's eyes were crossed when Twilight released her.
Ow!
Pinkie rubbed her own face with a forehoof.
Twilight, rocks are hard. You're okay. Oh, you're okay.
Twilight laughed with relief.
Pinkie, wait.
She said, when she saw Pinkie start to fold her hind legs. Pinkie dropped onto her haunches.
Owie!
She whimpered, and tears sprang to her eyes. The bolt sticking out of her rump had pushed a little deeper in.
Don't say I didn't warn you.
Twilight wiped away the moisture clinging to her own eyelids.
Come on. Let's get that out.